Welcome to the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Melanie Jackson. I'm a clinical and research midwife with my PhD, and each episode I cast a critical eye over current maternity care practice by grappling with research and historical knowledge to help you get the best out of your pregnancy, birth, and postpartum journey. To get access to all the research that I use to create every single podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com. Welcome to today's episode of the Great Birth Rebellion podcast. I have two special guests here with me today, and we're about to delve into the topic of the decolonisation of birth. I'd love to introduce to you Amy Aroha and Kiralee Dawn. Welcome, Amy, and welcome, Kiralee, to today's episode. I'd love if you guys could kick us off with an introduction to yourself, what you're up to at the moment, a little bit about your heritage, and what makes you invested in this topic of decolonisation of childbirth.
Okay. Hi, thank you for having me. I want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Bunjalung country, from Wanawakal country in the Bunjalung Nation. Just want to pay my respects to the elders, the ongoing custodians of this land, and extend that acknowledgement to the lands you're on, the elders and the custodians of those lands, and the ones that the listeners are tuning in from as well, acknowledging that this podcast will go across many different times and spaces and lands. So my name is Kiralee Dawn. I am a Barkindji woman, also with British heritage. I grew up on Darug country in Western Sydney, where you are, and I have been living here on Bunjalung country for the last 6 years. I have been a doula for 7 years now, and I work with The Returning, which is an Aboriginal-run, female-led charity here on Bunjalung country, and I manage the postpartum care program, which is a community-based postpartum care program for First Nations women and mothers in the community, where we provide them with postpartum meals, resources, and just culturally safe care for women our way. In terms of why I'm deeply invested in this topic, it would be because of my matriarchal lineage and the stories and the impact that colonisation has had on my old women and the birthing women, and how that's impacted my family. But it's also because of what I see in the community today, in the way that it is still impacting First Nations women, of course, and others. Yeah, it's because of what I see and the way that we actually need community solutions for these problems.
Thanks for the beautiful introduction, Kiralee, and Mel, thanks for hosting this conversation. I think it's really important in the birthing space, but also just in our communities in general, and to be able to have this discussion reach so many people. Grateful for that. So my name is Amy Aroha. I'm a mixed race woman of Te Raroa and Ngāpuhi iwi in Aotearoa. Our marae ancestral land is in a little place called Ofata, which is in far northland of Aotearoa. I'm also of Scottish and Irish lineage on my maternal side, and I'm living as a settler on Bunjalung country. And we are a family, a big family that are living on this land and walking as humbly as we can on this land. We're building an off-grid home at the moment. My work is largely with women and people across the birthing continuum, but also outside of the birthing continuum, people who are wanting to understand themselves and how their experience interacts with systems and structures within our world, within our communities. So there is a big focus on colonisation and the impact that colonisation has had on our minds and in our homes and in our communities on a localised level, but on a broad stroke level. So this is meaningful to me because I am of a colonised lineage. I have witnessed firsthand the complete disconnection and erasure of cultural knowledge on my maternal side. because we have an ancient historical colonisation of Irish and Scottish peoples. And I have seen the very recent impact of colonisation on my paternal lineage and my Māori side. So I've really witnessed firsthand the violence that colonisation enacts on Indigenous people specifically and particularly, but humanity generally. And so from my perspective, colonisation is actually at the root of the harm that we see and the severances that we see within our society today. I would say it is actually the root of so much of our disharmony as a people, as humanity.
As you said, the root cause is colonisation, and now I'm really keen to explore the ripple effect of that. So if we can kick off by first explaining for young players, there's potentially people listening to this podcast who have never even considered the word or concept or understood the idea of colonisation. So if we can pare it right back and explain what is colonisation.
First, from my perspective, colonisation is essentially the invasion on an occupation of land and peoples in order to exploit that land and those people. So it is when a land is already occupied, there are already inhabitants living on that land, and another peoples come with the intention to occupy that land. Integral to colonisation is assimilation. Colonisation happens through erasure of the original people who inhabited that land. So colonisation is actually an ongoing process. It's not a singular event. It's not an event in the past. It's still happening today. The lands that we reside on today are still being colonised. They are still being exploited. The Indigenous peoples of these lands are still being marginalised. Integral also, what colonisation upholds is the system of white supremacy. So white supremacy is the system or structure of white superiority and Eurocentric ways of being as superior to all other ways of being. So in relation to birth, this is an example of how colonisation has manipulated the mind to believe that one, and the systems and structures that exist in our society, to believe that there is one way, the right way to birth, and how we need to navigate the system, and all other ways are alternative to that. Not only alternative, but inferior to that.
Mm-hmm. Is it different to invasion, or is that the same?
From my perspective, it's the same thing.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. It's because the same thing.
We did not consent. So for Māori people in Aotearoa, we did not consent to the occupation of Aotearoa, and the First Nations people here did not consent to the occupation of the lands. And there's a lot that goes into that long and sordid history and how colonisers or the colonial entity established itself so strongly and firmly, but integral to it is violence and assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think the languaging is important. I'm glad you asked about if it's invasion. I think sometimes people think that it has to look incredibly violent, physically violent, which it has, absolutely, and still does, definitely still does. And it also exists in subtle ways as well. I would say it is a dominant culture that looks at powering over dominance, violence and subjugation as a way for it to succeed. The way of colonization is not a way where everybody gets to be well and in control of their lives and being able to access choice and autonomy and self-determination. And the way that it can look is extreme violence. It can also look like subtle ways of coercion, of domination, of violence, oppression, of taking away people's choice. And we see the full spectrum of that play out in the birth room.
Yes. Let's give an example. So colonization of these lands that we live on now, the intention of the colonizing entity at the time was to bring a British outpost, to essentially create a British outpost on these lands. And integral to that, essentially creating a little Britain, was the erasure of the existing inhabitants of this land. And that came through the lie of Terra Nullius. lie of terra nullius was that these lands were not inhabited, that there was no one here, and so therefore it was available for the taking. But if we rewind even further to the 1400s, to the doctrine of discovery, this was a hugely significant time in history whereby the Catholic entity was essentially said, if you travel to lands and the people of those lands are pagan, or they are not Catholic, they're not religious, then those lands are available for the taking. So colonization is a long, long, long history that extends back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, that has been slowly, in some ways, but rapidly in others, eroding the fabric of our humanity and of our connection to place and our connection to land, and establishing itself, the system of colonization and of white supremacy, as the dominant system and everything else as inferior or alternative.
Mm-hmm. And the colonizers, I imagine, genuinely believe that they're right and that they are better and that they're potentially doing the people a favour, I'm using inverted commas, by rescuing them from their own ignorance or their own ways. Like, this could be the mindset of somebody who has an intention to colonize and invade a space, is that actually we could offer something better and that your way is not as good as our way. And so let us, again, inverted commas, help you.
Yes.
Perhaps, but that also means that they, in general, to have a lack of empathy, of truly empathizing and listening to other people, that prioritizes their lack of empathy, and they're still their dominant way of knowing, being, and doing above all others. Yeah, it's still a caretaking that centers their way of knowing, being, and doing above the well-being of others. And in the past, that we were saying we want to take care of you, we want to help you. How do you explain the massacres? How do you explain the intentional poisoning of people? How do you explain the intentional removal of children from families, displacing them so far across the country that it is impossible for people multiple generations on? I cannot go back and find where some of my ancestors were taken from, because when I look back through the records, there is more information written about how many sheep these people had and where those sheep went and where it got traded to. And the only information that they might have given at these missions about children that were stolen was girl aged 5. Know her name, know where she came from, nothing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a dehumanization that is inherent in this process of colonizing people. And all of those examples I gave, there's still versions of all of those things that are playing out today still. And that idea of, we know better and we're going to caretake you and we're doing this for the good of you, that kind of mentality still persists today, and is still why you see families being ripped apart, people like Indigenous people being incarcerated. First Nations people in this country are the highest, we have the highest number of incarcerated people in the world. And you're still seeing mob killed in the streets. Yeah, that mentality persists, but I think that mentality is dangerous.
Yeah. Because primary to this crystallized form, and we can look at it in historical records written by figureheads throughout history, the savages, and this lie of Western civility and European civility, that actually this was a delusion to come into people's lands with the idea that they need to be rescued from themselves or saved from themselves in their own savagery and their own primitive nature, quote unquote, but to come in with the most savage means imaginable. Mm-hmm. It's a cognitive dissonance there. It's delusional. And so while that might have been the lie that they told themselves, the reality, and certainly not everyone that came into lands or were brought over to lands as colonizers or settlers, but absolutely the systems of power and the figureheads of these times deeply, deeply racist, deeply violent, a violence that we're still seeing it playing out in parts of around the world. That violence, we cannot underestimate the magnitude of the violence and the savagery that was brought over to Indigenous lands.
Yep. So to say that Australia is still racist and rooted in white supremacy is considered offensive to a lot of people.
I would ask everybody to get curious with that and to really feel into your body and feel into that sensation that arises when we have these conversations, because this is just truth telling.
Yeah.
And how do we get together and unite as a people, as a human race, if we can't tell each other the truth? You know, it's integral to actually healing. And so there's a grief in that for this severance that has happened across the globe.
Yeah. I would also suggest to people who this does sound unusual, they're like, I don't think about it in that way, or I don't see how colonization is still happening, would be, are you in relationship with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people? Like, are you in relationship with First Nations people on the land that you live on? Are you involved in community events? Do you go to them? Do you actively try and be in relationship with people? Because this is not new news to anybody who's First Nations. This is people's own stories. This is their family stories. This is their community stories. If you are in relationship with community, this isn't going to be new news to you. So if it is, my question would be, are you in relationship with mob? Like, are you in relationship with people in your community? And then maybe thinking about becoming, because First Nations people listening, this will not be new to them. And I really want to acknowledge that, because I understand for non-Indigenous people it might be, and you probably have a lot more non-Indigenous people listening to this podcast, but just for mob that are listening, I know you might say it in a different way. I'm just speaking for myself here and the work I do with community up here. It's going to look very different compared to what country people are on. Community needs look really, really different compared to what community and what country people are in. And maybe just even acknowledging that for listeners is that this is not one country here in so-called Australia. This is hundreds of countries with hundreds of cultures, with hundreds of languages. Everybody everywhere has really different ways of being and doing things. So yeah, being in relationship with the land and the people you're on is really important.
Yep. And here in Australia, I've just recently turned 40, and even at school, we were told that Australia was like around 200 years old, and here's our history, and this is how we came here. And nothing really. I don't recall being taught the history of Aboriginal people. It was only when I went to university and started studying healthcare that anybody even mentioned that there was a lack of equity between the care and health of white people and Indigenous Australians, that I even realised there was a problem. So yeah, I think to a lot of people this is going to be brand new, because I don't think we've been taught Australian history as it genuinely truly was.
And this is how the colonization of a people and of a land happens. It's not always overt violence or racism. It's insidious. It's covert. It is woven through the very fabric of our societies, of the institutions that only exist because of colonization. How can it not be that way when these institutions have arisen and been founded upon policies like White Australia policy? So I want to give an example from Aotearoa, that through colonization of Aotearoa, we saw, I'm going to relate it to birth, the introduction of political policies that forced our women from the whare, from the home, to birth within a patriarchal, Eurocentric, racist system. So we went from being incredibly fertile people, 5 children per family on average, to being almost completely infertile through the introduction of diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. We then see our histories of birthing in the whare, birthing in our homes with our whānau, with our kinship systems, and birth being a normal, natural event, to then being relegated into these systems where there's no Māori working. Māori can't be midwives, even though we have extensive knowledge and hands-on experience of supporting physiological birth. It's only white women, it's only Pākehā in those systems caring for our Māori women. We go from being active birthers with birthing trees, standing, moving, singing during our births, to being relegated onto our backs, to being drugged, to having our babies forced from us. Traditionally, our whenua, our placenta, is a sacred organ that is integral to the health of our people, and how we would handle that whenua was everything. It protected the whānau, protected the baby, to then having in the system our placentas incinerated, ripped from our bodies and incinerated. So this is what colonization does, and then it erases it so that it naturalizes it within the culture. So if we don't know what we don't know, if you don't know how we came to be where we are today, with 1 in 3 women at least across this country experiencing birth trauma, or at least reporting that they've experienced birth trauma, 1 in 10 experience walking away from birth with PTSD at least. This is just women who report, and we know not all women report. A small fraction of women report. So these systems were established through colonization. It's unreasonable to expect that our Indigenous women here and in Aotearoa are going to be treated fairly, specifically, but all women, all people in general who birth within that system are birthing within the colonial system.
Yeah. So colonization at its core is invested in the eradication and destruction of the culture and people of the place that they invaded.
Mm-hmm.
And then to perpetuate the stories that they generate about that event, those events. And the other thing that dominates when colonization occurs is the valuing of written histories over oral histories. And so there's this really big problem now where things that are written down are valued, and things that were passed down orally are not valued as a way of knowing. And so it seems as though a lot of histories are written by colonizers, and so they get to write the history.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, I think, if it had been the other way and the colonizers had oral histories, they'd be prioritizing oral histories. I think at the end of the day, they're prioritizing whatever they come with. Our oral histories were not lost. We didn't have them for over 100,000 years, or since time immemorial, and then lose them somewhere along the way. No, they were systemically, and they still are systemically, taken and stolen. We didn't lose our culture, and there are still a lot of people who and a lot of families and a lot of countries who have their histories and have their stories, and they haven't succeeded. They haven't succeeded in taking all of that from us, but they have done their best to try.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still happening. It's an ongoing event. So we know in Aotearoa now there's a big push by the political system to delegitimize te reo Māori, which is the language of Māori. A lot of the country is up in arms about the use of te reo Māori so commonly throughout Aotearoa. So it's still happening today. We just don't have the language, or the general population, the language to name it and to see it for what it is. My father, as an example, in his schooling experience, they weren't allowed to speak te reo Māori. You come to school, if you speak te reo Māori, you're hit. There's violence enacted against you, and this is generations of the erosion of our reo. And it's the same here. I'm sure Kiralee can expand on that. But this is, again, the education system as an arm of the colonizing entity to erase who we are. in Aotearoa, our tohunga, our medicine people, there was a policy written in and put into place to criminalise our tohunga. So they were our birth keepers, they were our medicine people, they were our doctors. They were a library. And that policy, written into the system, the political system, spanned for 50 years.
Mm.
How much knowledge is lost over a 50-year period? It's only because of our ancestors and relatives' resiliency and strength and absolute determination to maintain oral history and maintain our tikanga and traditions that they still exist today.
Yeah.
It's in spite of the system.
Mm.
In naming that for people who don't know here, if they don't know that they're within the history of this colonised lands, that they were removing mob to missions, and that in otherwise, the same thing, we were not allowed to speak the language, not allowed to practice traditions, removed from family altogether, so not able to continue practicing culture. And as Amy said, like total testament to all our old people and ancestors and people today who are still doing the work of weaving back knowledges and weaving back languages and things that have been stolen back together. And that culture and language and this way of knowing exists not just in our people, but it exists in the land, it exists in our ancestors, it exists in places beyond what the colonizers can touch. And we are able to keep reweaving these knowledges and these ways of being back together despite them.
Yeah.
I got chills.
Yeah, that was powerful.
Yeah. What came up for me listening to you is birth as one of these places. When we are really supported to birth in our way, whatever that means for us as Indigenous peoples, it activates something that nobody can ever take, nobody can ever teach. It exists on an ancestral cellular level.
What does colonization do to the people that were the victims of that process? What happens to them over time? And we know immediately there was rapid eradication, rampant disease, taking children, taking land, violence, the destruction of culture. But over time, what happens to those people? What's happening for them now?
Well, what we see, what is happening for people, and again, very different depending where you are, and I don't want to perpetuate a narrative of sort of the homogenization of First Nations people in this country, because again, it's like talking about Europe as a continent, really different depending on historically the way colonization was impacted. For example, here on the East Coast, we were the first hit by colonization. So the way that colonization impacts mob on the East Coast looks different to the way it impacts mob in the desert or up in the Northern Territory or WA. Like it has absolutely impacted everybody, but that impact does look different. But it's the incredibly high incarceration rates. It is First Nations women being 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth in the hospitals here. It is the rising number of First Nations children being removed from their families today. It is the way that people are treated by the police. It is the racism we see within the communities on overt and covert ways.
I just keep getting the word destruction is in my mind. It just feels like a smash and grab effort, but that also with an intentionality to eradicate an entire people and culture. And so how do we come back? Because you guys talk about decolonization, and we'll rein it into decolonization of childbirth. In the episode that we did, the previous episode to this, I ran through a paper which was called Challenging Colonization of Childbirth. and it was written by some Indigenous researchers. So we know that colonisation impacts everything: how people raise their children, how they're educated, how they receive medical or health care, everything, their language. So it definitely, undoubtedly, would impact upon birth practices. And in the last episode, we talked about the birth practices that were identified pre-colonisation and what women did. And Amy, the paper was talking about birthing trees and birthing caves and how they used those as part of giving birth and who was with them and the role of the Indigenous midwives. And the Aboriginal midwives were identified as pillars within the culture that connected women and babies to land and to their country. And one of the tools of the colonizers was to make their work illegitimate by outlawing it. So no longer could you work or be identified as a midwife if you didn't have a certification. And then the women were encouraged to come to the hospitals because that's where, again, quotes, they were safer. And the Indigenous midwives weren't working in it. Those were European and colonizing midwives. And so it was identified as a tool to pick apart the fabric of communities, to discredit and take midwives out of the birthing experience for Indigenous women, and also to move them off the places where they would usually give birth. So when we talk about decolonizing childbirth, what does that mean?
Also, just like, thanks for asking the things that are, what I want to say is that, yes, they have, all those things you said. And I just want to say that this is what I've been told, is that when those first fleets came here, they didn't have midwives on the boats. So they were relying on First Nations midwives when the first colonizers came to help their women give birth. So they did know how intelligent our midwives were. They knew how successful they were because they were being helped by our midwives. And I just want to name that for people listening. They didn't have midwives when they first came out here, so they relied on us.
Yeah, and actually that paper does make mention of how the women who came were, yes, relying on the Indigenous midwives to help them too. And there's named Indigenous midwives who were known to colonizers, and they, in this article, name the midwives who came to the white women to help them give birth. I love that you made that point.
For me, decolonizing is about returning to Indigenous ways of knowing, being, doing. And that looks like across all levels, on a systemic level. But what I'm really interested in is also in the personal level and in the moment-to-moment ways that we are with ourselves and each other and with the land. I mean, there's so much that needs to change in a systemic way, but maybe what I'll speak to is just, what I'm really interested in is the ways that we can decolonize personally and within our moments and our ways of being, and I guess really from a somatic level as well, because colonization impacts every level.
Maybe a fear that comes with that. When settlers hear decolonize, what does that mean? Or when they hear land back, what does that mean for them? That means that I won't have a place. That means that I can't exist within these spaces. Decolonization, from my perspective, as a settler living on this land, so I really want to let Kiralee speak to decolonization from a First Nation perspective, so I can speak from my nuanced perspective as a mixed race woman. It's not about completely smashing life as we know it and eradicating everything, and sometimes that's how I do want to do things. But I'm learning to be more realistic, and it's about, from my perspective, coming home to who we really are and what it is we really need as human beings. Because if we can all have an understanding of that, then we can start to understand where colonization is impacting us and our communities. We understand that we need holistic healthcare. which is not just we're going to get the baby out no matter what, and your spiritual and cultural safety and health doesn't matter so long as that baby and you are alive. There are many more factors that need to be privileged and prioritized to truly have a healthy mother-baby dyad. And what's happened through colonization specific to birth is the erosion of that knowledge that we are holistic beings, that we have holistic needs, that there are things that need to happen and that must happen for a mother to birth optimally and to come out well. Not come out like she's been to war, but to come out well and thriving, to feel connected to her culture, to feel held and midwifed by her culture. Culture isn't a subtext to the systemic understanding of safety. It is safety. It is equal to, and for some people even more so than our physical safety, to have our spiritual and cultural safety prioritized and protected. That's my experience. That as having birthed 4 babies physiologically, 3 of them at home with just my partner, it's my cultural and spiritual safety actually comes first. And so it's not just Indigenous peoples that need this. It's all peoples and in their own way, but we do need to amplify and prioritize for First Nations people and Māori women, Indigenous people all over the world, their ways of being for them, and to actually learn from those ways of being, because they have a long, thriving, sustainable history, far longer than the colonial history on these lands and in Aotearoa.
When people hear the word decolonisation, what they're thinking of is this somehow a repeat of the act of colonisation, but in reverse. Is what I think people think. That, what do you mean? Are you saying now you want to take everything from us and give it back to them and leave us with nothing? And everybody gets really upset about the concept of decolonisation, because that means you want to put us at some kind of disadvantage.
They do have an understanding of reality and the impact of colonisation, and they fear it.
Yeah.
Because they know of the trauma and pain and injustice, and now the inequity that exists because of it and is maintained because of it. And I would say Indigenous peoples, for the most part, do not roll like that. That's not how we do it. Of course, we're not immune to social issues and to issues within our social systems, but there is an egalitarian quality of lateral power. And lateral power is power that is not hierarchical. The colonized concept of leadership and power is one person or a system of people at the forefront or on top, making all the decisions. That's not lateral power. Lateral power is the circle. To give a mental image. It's that everybody actually has an equal role and equal place in our collective thriving.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point you made, and it's about reimagining for a lot of people, imagining something different than they've ever known. Because if you've grown up within this system, like all of us have, and it's reflected everywhere, it is this hierarchical, power over dominant way of being and doing and organising with each other. I want to give an example from Bundjalung country up here after the floods, and the work we did and saw with the Koori Mail. That was such an example of Black organising, Black leadership. And for those who don't know, we had a huge natural disaster up here on Bundjalung country in 2022 with the floods. We had 2 major floods that harmed the people, the land. It was many reasons for it. And what we saw at the Koori Mail and the way that we were organising to do things, the leadership was adaptable. There was women. We were leading the recovery efforts, and our Black brothers and uncles were standing aside us and underneath us. So we actually saw women leading the way, but we saw our Black brothers were really standing there lifting us up, or, what do we need to do, putting into action where the women saw that the need was. No one was standing over the top of someone and saying, well, that community out there, like, they need this, they need that. It was, who's got mob in that place? Who knows where these people are? It was relationship based. There was no powering over. The community were able to say what we needed. We didn't leave anybody behind. Even though that this was a Black space, we weren't just servicing the Black community, we were serving the entire community. We had the police and the army coming to us and asking us where the people were and what to do, because everybody's so in deep relationship with each other in place that we all knew where each other were and where mob were and what people were needing. The Black grapevine is strong, and that the systems didn't know where to go. They didn't know where people were. They didn't know about these Aboriginal communities in different places, but they also just didn't know about where everyone was here. So it was place-based, it was relationship-based, it was adaptable. It was this real circular way of doing things. There was not people telling each other. It was just such a different way of organising, and it was, so successful that you these government systems who get paid to do this kind of work coming and having to ask us where to go and what to do. And so how we see it play out in the birth room, it's like, we see this powering over, the coercion, the domination, there is one way of doing things, and it's the way that the Western white society has decided at the time is the way to do it. Because often what they do too is then look back and decide that Indigenous ways of doing it are better now, and okay, now we're going to bring that in, but still tell you how to do it in the way that we decide, even though it's based on Indigenous knowledge systems. And what we're looking at is more of a, as Amy said, circular way of doing it, but a way where you are allowing people to have the self-determination and to decide for themselves what does work best for them, what works best for their family. How can you maintain connection to the land, maintain connection to your culture, to your spirituality, to your ancestors, to a more holistic way of health within the birth space. And you see that play out not just in a systemic way, but it is in the way that we speak to each other. It is the way that people can access choice. Like, that is a really big one. People having choice, people being able to define for themselves what is in their best health interests as defined by them, not just with the measure markers being what a system says, here's the hoops that you have to jump through and this is the measurements that you have to go by. Even just looking at pace, a colonised way of thing is rushing, it is urgency, it is defining the pace of things. Indigenous ways with pace, it happens differently. If you look to nature, there is all different levels of pace playing out. You have places that are incredibly slow, and you have places where there is a quickening and a faster pace, but it all exists. It can't be measured and told that it is one way.
I would share from colonial model perspective that our men, for instance, there's an incredible researcher and author called Ngahuia who wrote a beautiful book called Te Awa Atua, which translates to the river of the gods, which is a term for our menstruation. Because our menstruation connects us to the cosmos. It connects us down our lineage to the very first ancestor and then beyond into the cosmos, the river of the gods. And she tells of our men as almost jealous of our ability to carry forth life, because it was such an honour to bring forth the new mokopuna, the new grandchild, the new child into the iwi, into the tribe, to continue the whakapapa of the people, the lineage of the people. Men were so enamoured and in awe of that jealousy, or that awe is a better word, that awe becoming a need to dominate and control. It actually became a holding that men were in fact birth keepers. Men were, and young boys were supported in that path as well. They'd go and collect our kai, our food, our most nutrient-rich food would come to the pregnant women, and the men would prepare that kai. The men would be responsible for postpartum care. The men would be making sure they held the space while we were bleeding, even when we would have our period every month, because that's a time where our womb is shedding, not just for us as women, but for our people, to cleanse the womb. The name of the womb is Te Whare Tangata, the house of humankind, the house of humanity. So we can see just through these oral stories, right, these stories that we hold so dearly, just how valuable birth is, how valuable the womb is, how valuable womanhood is to not only our men, but to our whole communities. So from my perspective, that's integral. That is what it means to me to decolonize birth, is to learn from those knowledge systems and to bring that back in, not only on a systemic level, but on a community level and in our whare, in our homes, in our immediate family systems, because that's where real grassroots change happens. It's the people who will demand change. Decolonizing is the work of everyone. We're all colonized. You can't escape it. We're all colonized. Therefore, it is our responsibility, if we want to create a better, more connected, more harmonious and sustainable world where human health and longevity is safeguarded, we must decolonize our minds and ways of looking at the world so that we can be holistic beings again, because that's what we are. So to me, decolonizing isn't destruction. It's life. It's rebirth.
Yeah, I was just thinking that as you said
Yes.
it, I thought, do you know what? Decolonization is about restoration. So colonization was about destruction, but decolonization isn't the same act of colonizing, but towards the other party. It's actually restoration of what was lost during colonization. So the idea is not to disenfranchise anybody in the process. It's actually to introduce not new ways of knowing, other ways of knowing that were made illegitimate by the process of colonization, and bringing them back into legitimacy so they're respected and understood as another way of knowing, and that no way of knowing is
we are a
more
measure
authoritative
of our
over
people.
another.
This is inherently Indigenous knowledge, that we are only as good and as thriving as the whole. This is collective care. This is collective care, and this is what we've lost in our hyper-individualistic colonized culture. There's this knowledge that, you can keep up with the Joneses and you can be getting by and you can be doing well on an individual level, but you are just an expression of, reflection of everything else. And when you look around and not everybody's thriving, then you're not thriving either.
We are as healthy as the collective, and also that we are as healthy as the land. And if the land and the country we're on is unhealthy, then how are we going to be healthy, and how are we going to have good births and healthy births? And why should we have really healthy births and these things when the land is not healthy too, and is not having healthy, a healthy way of reproducing and thriving? Why are we above nature in that way? We're not. It all has to be coming together. And in that point about the Indigenous ways of knowing and returning to other ways of knowing, it's like you said before, Mel, that's okay, the written knowledge or these ways of knowledge that are prioritized, but what about stories? What about the knowledge from our old ones, or people from the grandmothers, but ancestors before? What about our dreams? What about the knowledge we get from our dreaming and from our dreams when we're asleep? Like, what about the knowledge we get from our intuition? There's so many ways of knowing. And I think too that colonization really prioritizes the destination.
Yes.
And not the way there. It looks at what we're doing, but not how we're doing it. It's not worried about how we do things, how we're treating each other on the way. It's just worried about where it's getting to. And the how we do things is really important. How we care for each other, how we care for the land.
We're going to get this baby out of you, no matter what it takes, even if you don't consent. Truly, we're going to get this baby out of you. Tick our box. It doesn't matter about the journey. Actually, the journey is everything. The journey is everything.
Well, Western ideas of birth do prioritize the product. Again, I'm using speech marks. The product and that is that the mum and the baby are alive at the end. And so we look at outcome measures in terms of how many babies were alive, how many babies didn't survive, how many were damaged, how many went to special care. We don't ask any other questions. And so that, end result is the aim. And like you said, the process is disrespected. This is really similar to the process of demedicalizing birth, because medicalization is a product of colonization. And so I think discussions that relate to the demedicalization of birth are synonymous with the decolonization of birth, because demedicalizing birth understands that there's other ways that birth can happen that don't involve a medical person be in that space, and that birth can still thrive in the absence of the perceived expert. And that's not a comfortable concept when you're in a medicalized frame of mind. And so, I see these two things as really similar. I don't know if that's an appropriate kind of comparison to make, whether or not demedicalization and decolonization are part of the same process.
Women who choose and families who choose a medicalized birth, that should be a choice. That still we are able to weave care, tenderness, holistic care and tenderness throughout, and cultural care and spiritual care. I know for me, what my ancestors wanted for me was choice at the end of the day. To have choice. You want to navigate that system, okay, you still deserve your dignity complete, to have your dignity held and respected. You want to divest from that system, great. No matter what choice you make, your humanity is valued.
This is the stories that we hear from women as well who've experienced trauma in birth, is that it wasn't necessarily the outcome that traumatized them, it was how they were treated. And I recall a story from a client who was planning a VBAC and for her second birth with me, and she laboured and laboured and laboured for 8 or 9 days. And by the end, she said to me, I want another cesarean section now. And I said, right, let's go. And we went and we got to hospital, and they were so kind to her and said, wow, you've worked so hard. You've done an amazing job. We want to help you. What do you need from us? She said, I want a cesarean section. And they said, okay, we'll get that organized. We're not sure when it will happen. She was so upset because it had been such a long time and she was absolutely ready to have the baby. The doctor said, I'm gonna see what I can do. And he raced back and he's like, I can take you right now. And she's like, oh my gosh, everybody was amazing. She still had a cesarean section, but she was traumatized by her first cesarean section and she was healed by her second one. And so it was big. And she said, it's just because everybody looked after me and everybody was kind to me and everybody listened to me, and I got to try what I wanted to try. And then I got to have the birth in the way that I felt like I needed to have my baby. And so again, it wasn't the destination. That's recorded as cesarean section, right? And we could look at that and go, oh, look at the cesarean section rate. I'm like, but look at this healed woman. And she had what she would consider as an amazing birth experience. I love that you just highlighted the impact of the journey over the outcome. I want to move to now what everybody else can do to aid in the journey towards decolonization. So I think about Aboriginal women who have no choice but to enter into a mainstream birthing system and who go through a fragmented system where they don't know who's caring for them. And I'm imagining the midwife at the birth unit who's receiving a woman into her care. She's an Indigenous woman and is birthing in their facility that in no way has a structure to care for these women adequately. What advice do you have for that midwife on how to give culturally appropriate care in that moment, knowing that there has been a deficit already throughout that whole woman's care through her pregnancy? What can that midwife do to not accentuate the issues that this woman is facing as a result of colonization?
She can ask that woman what she needs, and then she can listen to her And then she can do everything in her power to support that woman to have her choices met. And she can let that woman be the authority on her birth. She can accept that maybe she wants to have a lot of family members in the room with her. And she can accept that that's what safety looks like for that woman. She can accept that maybe that woman isn't talking to her much. And maybe it's because she's a bit shy. And I've heard of a lot of stories of midwives or healthcare workers calling social services because they see a woman acting in a way that's a bit different than what they're used to, and then they make an assumption that maybe she's got somehow connected with drugs and alcohol, or that there's DV, or there's something going on, and their first point of call then is to call social services, and it starts a whole conveyor belt of mess. And then we have some great aunties and grandmothers doing work sometimes in hospitals up here to sort of try and undo and mitigate this. And then they'll circle back around, they'll realise that woman was shy and she didn't trust them. Don't expect that you deserve to be trusted as a healthcare provider in that room. Expect that maybe that woman's not going to trust you, doesn't know you, you know. Understand what you don't know, I think. Like, understand you don't know her lived experience and you don't know what she's coming into that room with. So I would say, instead of positioning yourself up on top of her and wondering, what can I do to help, to save, to rescue her, to fix things, how can I be the one, just come down a bit underneath her and lift her up and aside, and you just ask her, what do you need? And what do you want? And respect that it might look different than what you think should be the answer, and make space for that.
Midwives could do that.
Gently. Go gently.
I don't think that's out of reach. We can all do that. I mean, we really should be doing it for every single woman. But midwives can do that. There's no reason why we couldn't.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is making space for something different than what you know, and respecting that difference is probably, if it's coming out of this woman's mouth, the best thing for them, and respecting that.
Having an understanding of the systems that we live within and that we navigate together, and how different our experiences of that are, and the power dynamics at play. The second that Indigenous woman steps into a colonial system, it's a different experience to when a Pakeha woman or a white woman steps into that same system. So understanding that you don't know what that's like and humbling yourself to that. And I think that is just, essentially amplifying what Kiralee has shared so beautifully there. Humbling yourself to that, humbling yourself to being shown that you don't know. You don't know what that woman needs, and she knows what she needs, and to honour that to the best of your ability. And I would say, if that means finding ways to subvert the system, do that.
My game, subversion of the system. That's the Great Birth Rebellion, actually. The whole thing. I feel like we've covered a lot. Do you think there's anything that would add to this conversation that we haven't already tapped into?
Yeah, I would like to just speak to community care as a way of subverting the system, and the fact that people can make great change by supporting community-led initiatives in their areas, in their community. In terms of First Nations people, it's about supporting First Nations-led initiatives. It's not about other people having the answer. There are a lot of mob doing a lot of good work in these areas, and there will be people doing that work. It might not look like a set-up organisation, but there are community members who are doing a lot of good work in whatever community that you live with, and it's about getting in and supporting them. So, for example, here in Bunjalung country, with the returning who I work with, We have a community postpartum care program. We provide 6 weeks of meals to First Nations families here after birth. We are doing it our way. We are going back and looking at how we can use native bush foods as much as possible in all of our postpartum meals. So we're taking the postpartum principles, but we're coming back to our meats, our bush foods to get the nutrients that we need so that we can have a cellular recognition. You know, we are intentionally doing it that way because we do not want mob to sit at home and eat food based on, say, Chinese medicine practices, which are great, but are really foreign to us. And you don't want to sit there in your postpartum and feel like you have to eat food that doesn't feel like home. It doesn't feel like the food your grandmothers gave you or your mums gave you. We can all find ways to come back and make postpartum care or birthing care appropriate to our own communities and our own cultures. We also, in sort of decolonising this kind of work, we actually don't just service mums after they give birth. We also work with grannies and nans who have just taken on kinship care. So we're also providing food for those families because sometimes you'll have nans who are taking on 6 kids overnight. We had that up here recently with one family and, you know, the youngest was 4 months old. So they need postpartum care. We provide these meals to mums who are leaving incarceration and they're coming back home and they're readjusting and reconnecting with their family. So they need that type of postpartum care. We're actually extending it beyond this colonial mindset of just the 6 weeks as postpartum and what does that mean, because within our community, making it adaptable and making it community needs-based, it looks different for us. So I guess also all of us are opening the minds a little bit to make things a bit more community-based and needs-based, and then asking people to support this kind of work and the kind of work that other mob are doing in your community as well to look after people on the lands that you're on. That's really important because we don't need solutions from above us or from others. There's a lot of community-based solutions that exist everywhere. It will be existing even if you don't already know about it. And even if you're already in the birth world and you know a lot about birth, there will be community-led and based solutions where you live. It will just probably look different than you think. Yeah.
Being aware of what we deem more legitimate or less legitimate, what you're valuing as superior and inferior.
Thank you so much for just helping us build a bridge over ignorance, over my ignorance too, because I think that lots of people just run from discussions about decolonisation because they don't know what to say. They feel like if they say something, it's going to upset somebody, or if they say something, it's going to create some kind of tension. But I just feel like this just offers a little more of a gateway and a bridge for people to start broaching these kinds of discussions. All right, final call for any more wisdom, or is there anything that you guys offer that you would love support for that people could get behind? Kirli, we've heard about your work with the returning as well.
So I free school my children, and for me that is integral to decolonising our home and ways of being and doing. So it's very much devoted to this work of decolonising how we look at systems of knowledge and ways of being, but beyond that, how integral our relational dynamics are with our children, and beyond that, to maintaining the status quo, changing the status quo. So that's my offering at the moment. I also just felt to offer that, you know, if we continue on this trajectory that we're on as a species, we're not going to last much longer. Our mokopuna, our grandchildren, aren't going to have the waterways that we have. They're not going to have the soils. They are eroding and being destroyed right before our very eyes, our natural world. if we continue on this trajectory of consumption in this country, we would need 3 planet Earths to actually survive. So the Earth will heal herself without human beings on her. So this is actually about us. It's not about us saving out there. It's about us saving ourselves as part of the web of life, as part of the natural world. We're not outside of it. We're inside of it. You know, my kids and I lie down and look up at the sky, and I remind them we're not actually looking up. We're just looking out because we're in it. We're in it all together. We're in this universe together. And so, I just felt to share that as a reason why, a fire to light under people to understand that this is our mahi as a shared species to decolonize and come home to a more sustainable and healed way of functioning.
I'd say that, these conversations are really important. I'm grateful for you to invite us in and to have them. I'd say that when people are feeling uncomfortable about having them themselves and how to engage, maybe just remembering it's not always what you're doing, it's how you're doing it. And that, you might not have the right words or whatever, but if the how is a way of deep respect, of knowing what you don't know, of making space for that known, and knowing that, acknowledging that the answer that might come might not look the way you think it's going to look, or come in the way you think it's going to come, but making space that it might be deeply intelligent in a way that you're not used to, kind of thing. I think we all need to have a lot more reverence for the unknown and the spaces in between the things. Yeah.
Thanks, Mel.
Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you both. To get free access to all the research that's used to create each podcast episode, you can join the mailing list at melaniethemidwife.com, or you can join our members hub and financially support the work of this podcast. In the hub, you can ask me questions, and premium members get access to a monthly Q&A episode where I answer listener questions. You'll also get episode transcripts and additional resources for each podcast episode. All the details are in the show notes.